So welcome to everyone to the second day of our virtual conference of 2020. I think it went quite well yesterday, incredibly smoothly. So we're starting at 2. We're going to be having a break at 3:15 for 10 minutes. Again, please try and stick to, well, please do stick to your maximum 15 minutes for the papers so that there's time for questions afterwards. We're all working in different time zones, so for some people it's late in the evening. Okay, I'm going to pass over to William now. If you want to see the speaker, go to the top right hand corner where it says speaker view, and then the person who is speaking with their PowerPoint will come up as the prime picture on your computer. Okay, I'm going to mute myself now and go away, and I shall hand over to William.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, according to where you are. Our first session today, I'm going to begin with Peter Villiers, who really doesn't need very much introduction, since he's the dramatist in ordinary to the Joseph Conrad Society. He served in the Army and the Merchant Navy, which is so apt for a Conradian, and he completed the book his father began, Joseph Conrad, Master Mariner. So I now hand you over to Peter Villiers.
Thanks. Am I on screen now?
Yes, you're on screen and we can hear you. At least I can hear you.
That's good. Good afternoon, or hello everyone. Peter Villiers. I'm going to talk about Conrad very briefly and then George Orwell and draw some comparisons. Can someone raise a hand to say they can hear me? Great, okay. Conrad's nationality is itself quite a problem. He was born a Pole, whatever that meant, or perhaps he was certainly born in the Ukraine. He, as an imperial subject, of Russia, I suppose, he moved to France, which was then an imperial power. He moved to England, which was again an imperial power. During his merchant service career, curiously, he served in the Congo under the King of the Belgians, and the Congo was his personal colony, i.e. the king's. And so, in effect, Conrad knew imperialism both from within and from without. How did he view imperialism? I think we have to say he viewed it badly. His views are easily inferred from his fiction, although he didn't write as a political activist, although there I want to compare him with Orwell. I want to leave aside Heart of Darkness because I don't think we can cover that in this timescale. Let's look at Under Western Eyes. I think Under Western Eyes can be seen as an attack upon Imperial Russia. Although, as usual with Conrad, this is far from a simple tale. If I might remind you, Razumov is a young student. His acquaintance plants a bomb and kills an official of the state. He then seeks refuge, and in effect, Razumov betrays his acquaintance so as to save his own life and well-being. He becomes an exile working for the Russian secret police, and he goes to Geneva, where he has a sort of crisis of conscience and reveals quite unnecessarily that he is a police agent. Why? Because he's fallen in love with Victor Halbin's sister. Victor Halbin is the man he originally betrayed, and he cannot bear to deceive her. So, is this a romantic story? Far from it. Is it an attack on autocracy per se? Well, yes and no. I would suggest that Conrad keeps his distance. The Genevan conspirators are presented in a far from flattering light, rather like the anarchists in The Secret Agent. And the person who tries to control his agent, i.e. Razumov, the person who tries to control him is Privy Councillor Mikulin, who is quite a likable person in a way, and rather like the assistant commissioner in The Secret Agent, he's a pragmatic creature. And by the end of this story, almost everyone has failed. The only person who seems to have survived is the bomber's sister, Natalia Haldin, and she isn't getting on very well either. So Conrad's own, if we disregard an expression of Conrad's views on imperialism and look at his views on revolutionaries, they're expressed very clearly by the English teacher of languages to Miss Haldin, and he urges her to have nothing to do with them. In a real revolution, he says, the best characters do not come to the front. A violent revolution falls into the hands of narrow-minded fanatics and of tyrannical hypocrites at first. Afterwards comes the turn of all the pretentious intellectual failures of the time. And I think that's one of the reasons, I think that is Conrad speaking himself through the mouth of someone else, and that does seem to represent his own view. And I would hate to comment on where Apollo Korzunovsky fits into that category. So do we see Conrad as a reactionary? I prefer to see him as a realist who sees all political systems as failures. And his views were very well expressed by Bertrand Russell, which I needn't quote because they're available on Wikipedia. So let me move on very briefly to The Secret Agent, which you all know extremely well, a tale of bitter irony. The main police personality, the assistant commissioner, is a pragmatist. He wants to get the better of his long-serving chief inspector, Heat. And secondly, to make sure the Home Secretary is made aware of who's really running affairs. And he has no interest in justice, I say, at all. So at the end of this so-called simple tale, the toll of death and destruction is considerable. And as you know it, is this simple tale intended as a tribute to the values and practices of a liberal democracy? Hardly. What does it tell us about imperialism? I would suggest not to look too far beneath the surface. Conrad, in my view, is not opposed to imperialism per se, as to hopefulness. And now we move on to an extraordinary contrast, although some similarities, with Eric Blair. Eric Blair wrote under the name George Orwell, but that wasn't his christened name, that was his chosen name. He called himself George Orwell because he said he was appalled by the Scottishness of Blair and the Norwegianness of Eric. So he was an early racially preoccupied. His background, he was English. His father was an imperial civil servant in the opium department of the Foreign Office. Their task was to promote the use of opium, not to discourage it, which the Chinese disliked intensely. And Orwell had a normal beginning for a sort of what he called himself an lower upper middle class Englishman. He went to Eton on a scholarship. His father failed to send him to university, and he joined the Indian Imperial Police, who was stationed in Burma. Whilst he was there, he decided that he disliked imperialism intensely. And he then pursued a second career. He bought himself out of the Indian Imperial Police. He left on grounds of sickness after 5 years. He came back to England and in effect became a writer. And to be honest, he wasn't at first a terribly good writer. He published some novels, but they didn't have any great success. And if we know him at all, it's because he later wrote 1984 and Animal Farm. But what I want to look at very briefly is his first published novel, which was called Burmese Days, which is in effect almost a satire on what it was like to be the Indian Imperial Police. And it shows that although Orwell wrote against imperialism, he was a very honest man. I think that's one of the reasons why we respect and remember him. And if you look at Burmese Days, he doesn't actually attack the imperialists per se and throughout. He presents them as characters. The main character in the story, John Flory, we can hardly call him the hero, is a sort of cynical forestry plantation manager in Burma who regards imperialism as simply a racket. Orwell satirizes Dr. Veeraswamy, the very keen Indian doctor stationed in Burma, who really admires the British, and Flory, or shall we say Orwell, rather finds this rather amusing. Flory is sabotaged by a local legal official, Upo Kin, who is extremely clever at subverting the British and their imperialism and does so remarkably well. But the person who survives in this story, the person who actually leaves at the top in the end, is the woman whom Flory would like to have married. That is Miss Lackerstein, who in the end becomes the top white woman in the area, the top memsahib, by marrying the district officer. And she may be culturally appalling as far as Orwell Florey is concerned. She may not be a good example of an imperialist, except to say that she is honest. She dislikes the Burmese culture entirely. She has no attempt to learn the local language or anything else. And in the end, she succeeds. So I rather feel that Orwell is perhaps saying that, A, in himself, he feels rather a cultural snob, that he doesn't like the fact that his fellow imperialists make no attempt to come to terms with what it means to be Burmese. Well, on the other hand, his own life is a failure. We could go on to discuss 1984, but I won't take up time on that. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I think if you compare Orwell and Conrad, they were both interested in imperialism. Their works, their fiction, attacks it in some ways, but at the same time, there's an era almost of fatalism about how they present imperialism. And Conrad in particular, whom I think we know better than Orwell, is not quite a reactionary, not quite a cynic, but more of a fatalist. There's an underlying irony in everything that he writes, and I think it comes through in Under Western Eyes, in The Secret Agent, certainly, and the story about the Narcissus, and certainly in Lord Jim. And there, I feel that I've used my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Well, you brought that well inside the 15 minutes. Our next speaker is Ahmed Honeini, he describes himself as an early career researcher. He received his PhD from Royal Holloway, the University of London, where he also teaches. He's here to some extent under false pretenses, since he's really an Americanist, because his first monograph is William Faulkner and Mortality, A Fine Dead Sound, which will be published by Routledge late in next year. So I'll now pass you over to Ahmed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. I can.
Fantastic. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So, in our Conrad, Peter Lancelot Malleus asserts that after William Faulkner first read Joseph Conrad at the age of 12, he never stopped reading Conrad after that point. Indeed, such was Conrad's hold upon Faulkner's imagination and literary output that very few, if any other writer, matched the lifelong consistency of his interest in Conrad. In an unpublished 1933 introduction to the novel The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner makes clear that in the process of writing that novel, he discovered the Flauberts and Dostoevskys and Conrads whose books I had read 10 years ago. Faulkner concludes this introduction by stating that his goal in writing The Sound and the Fury was to make myself a beautiful and tragic little girl. That girl, as anyone who has read The Sound and the Fury will know, is Caddy Compson, the only sister of Benji, Quentin, and Jason Compson. Indeed, from Faulkner's perspective, the entire point of the novel was to tell the story of Caddy's tragedy without the apparent indignity of having to reduce her to telling what was going on. In Faulkner's estimation, Caddy was the beautiful one. She was my heart's darling. That's what I wrote the book about, and I used the tools which seemed to me the proper tools to try to draw the picture of Caddy. At the heart of The Sound and the Fury lies the relationship between Caddy and her younger disabled brother, Benjamin Maury Compson, to whom she becomes a substitute mother figure from her childhood onwards. Indeed, to Faulkner, the only thing that held Benji into any sort of reality, into the world at all, was the trust that he had for his sister, that he knew she loved him and would defend him, and so she was the whole world to him. Malleus suggests that the more Faulkner comes into his voice, discovers and penetrates his subject, becomes singularly, unmistakably, autonomously Faulkner, the more his fiction, also of an invisible momentum and propulsiveness of its own, seems to recover, rewrite, and reread a belatedly recognized Conrad. If we follow Malleus's logic and trace all the lines within Faulkner's art back to Conrad, then we can indeed locate a direct antecedent to Caddy and Benjamin Compson through the characters Winnie Verloc and her disabled brother in The Secret Agent. Just as The Sound and the Fury is Faulkner's attempt to tell the somber story of Winnie Verloc from the days of her childhood to the end, as he tells us in his note to the novel from 1920. It was Conrad's intention with the secret agent to tell Winnie Verloc's story from its anarchistic end of utter desolation, madness, and despair, in which she and her brother Stevie are fatally ensnared in the blood-stained inanity of the Greenwich Observatory bombing. My purpose in writing this short paper, therefore, is to begin to compare the representations of disability and sibling relationships in both The Secret Agent and The Sound and the Fury. It is my contention that within The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner elaborates upon Conrad's concerns of social injustice, gender relations, and family in The Secret Agent. Despite the love and care that both Winnie and Caddy have for their brothers, they are unable to stop these poor boys from experiencing the cruelty, exploitation, and victimization of the modern age. By the end of this paper, I hope to have made inroads in proving that given the similarities between Winnie and Caddy, it is little surprise, as Faulkner himself once admitted in 1958, that he had got quite a lot from Conrad. As Remy Arab Fuentes quipped during his paper at the Conrad Society conference in 2017, it is not an overstatement to consider Joseph Conrad as being the figurative literary father of William Faulkner. Both Winnie and Caddy exist within explicitly marginalized and overtly patriarchal social positions. Bev Stone asserts that Winnie symbolizes all women in oppressive systems whose domestic containment makes masculine action possible, a statement that is also directly applicable to Caddy's upbringing in rural Mississippi. Throughout The Sound and the Fury, Winnie is seen as throughout The Secret Agent, Winnie is seen exclusively within the domestic realm of her home with her husband Verloc and the shop which he leaves nominally in charge of his brother-in-law, Stevie, upon going out in the morning. As he introduces her into the narrative, Conrad makes clear that Winnie preserved an air of unfathomable indifference behind the rampart of the shop's counter. Even prior to the events which befall Winnie and her brother, Conrad implies that her marriage to and subsequent life with Verloc has drained all the vivacity of Winnie's youth, to the extent that she comes to profoundly believe that things do not stand much looking into. Added to Winnie's unfathomable indifference towards life is the rejection that her brother Stevie suffers at the hands of her brother, who considers her son to be a terrible encumbrance upon her. Winnie's mother implicitly rejects her son. Indeed, she often refuses to even acknowledge that he is her son at all, and instead always appears to refer to him as that poor Stevie or the poor boy. The ambivalence that Winnie's mother has towards Stevie is inextricably linked to the disability that her delicate son is afflicted with. From the outset of the novel, she uses any justification she can in order to transfer her responsibility for her son onto Winnie, who is charged with protecting Stevie from this rough world. As Joseph Valente argues, the autistic subject in the modern age is treated as the embodiment of what Maggie Nasdin terms as a socially marked form of otherness, who is exiled to the fringes of the symbolic order. Indeed, the maternal rejection that Stevie suffers is matched by what Conrad calls Winnie's own quasi-maternal affection and vigilance for her brother. One has the impression that despite the fact that her life has been adversely affected and shaped by those around her, namely her husband and her brother, Winnie reciprocates the blind love for Stevie and that Conrad tells us Stevie has for her. Winnie's devotion to and care for Stevie to a great extent gives her lived experiences and her psychological inner life the purpose and meaning that her marriage to Verloc is completely devoid of. As Ellen Burton Harrington astutely observes, Conrad characterizes Winnie's life as constantly concerned with her brother and her anxiety to keep him from disturbing Verloc and to restrain his excess of compassionate feeling for the downtrodden. Winnie's excess of compassionate feeling is entirely concentrated on Stevie. In The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner reconfigures the love and devotion between the disabled brother and his loyal sister from late 19th century London to the early 20th century United States South. From the beginning of his novel, Faulkner makes clear that Caddy and Benji are equally marginalized within the walls of the Compson mansion. In words which directly mirror Winnie's mother's lament over the terrible encumbrance that Stevie's very existence has upon her, Benji's mother, Caroline, considers her son to be a judgment on me. As with Winnie's mother, Caroline Compson cannot see beyond the ways in which her son's disability adversely affects her. Critics such as Sarah McLaughlin suggest that Caroline's uncaring attitude brought out Benji's autism, a view which I hasten to add I don't necessarily agree with. Like Winnie's mother, Caroline effectively transfers all of her maternal duties and responsibilities over to Caddy, her young daughter. Caddy, like Winnie, gives her brother the unconditional love and attention that he requires. Indeed, rather than consider him an encumbrance or a judgment, Caddy from an early age attempts to empower Benji. She endeavors to give him the confidence and self-assurance that all those within the family, precisely because of his disability, consider him to be lacking. Rejecting Caroline's lament that Benji is a mere poor baby, Caddy insists to him that you're not a poor baby, are you? Are you? You've got your Caddy. Haven't you got your Caddy? Stacey Burton observes that Caddy offers Benji an outlet for his repressed, stifled language. She releases that language instead of contributing to its continual suppression as the rest of the family does. Burton writes that only Caddy speaks, listens, and responds to Benji as though he has the capability to engage in verbal dialogue. She alone involves herself with him in a way that suggests his discourse and history matter. As with Winnie's relationship with Stevie, Faulkner asserts that Caddy's care for Benji is unwavering, and is to a great extent precisely what makes her the subject of Benji's own enduring, immeasurable devotion and love. Yet the quasi-maternal affection and vigilance that both Winnie and Caddy enact to protect Stevie and Benji prevents either of these women from having the opportunity to tell their stories in their own words. Instead, both women are stripped of and are purposely kept from possessing the language needed to tell the reader of their own experiences, or indeed to liberate themselves from patriarchal and even fraternal interference. As Soane writes of Winnie, her avoidance of language attempts to escape negotiating with a reality that she declines to examine, the legalized relationship with a man who holds power in her life but whom she does not love, a critical perspective that can also be applied to her relationship with Stevie to a large extent. Along similar lines, Michael Schmidt writes that instead of having an active voice, Caddy is sense to Benji and textures. She attends to him, she is there for him, and then she is gone. She is merely a sense impression. Nevertheless, the care and devotion that these sisters have for their brothers is completely undermined by and held in stark contrast to the actions of the familial patriarchs, Adolf Verloc and Jason Compson. Verloc taking full advantage of the fact that, as Winnie herself says, he could do anything for that boy. He could do anything for that boy. He would go through fire for you. Condemns his brother to the literal fire and fury of the Greenwich Observatory explosion. Benji's younger brother, Jason, succeeds in making a blue gum out of him by having him castrated and committed to the state mental asylum. Both Conrad and Faulkner equate the disabilities of Stevie and Benji with an innate, profound vulnerability to the horrors and blood-stained inanities of the modern world that men like Verloc and Jason inhabit. The completely inhuman evil of these men is antithetical to the loving and nurturing vigilance that Winnie and Caddy have for their brothers. Although Winnie murders Verloc in a perverse act of devotion to her brother, dispatching the man who took the boy away from me to murder him, she is inadvertently led directly to Ossipon and eventually her suicide, the final act of madness and despair within the novel. After Stevie's death, as Jill Clark makes clear, Winnie has no purpose to her existence any longer, so she too becomes a human zero. Likewise, Caddy sacrifices herself through her marriage to Sidney Herbert Head, in part to support Benji after the family land is sold to subsidize the ill-fated Harvard education of their elder brother, Quentin, who commits suicide in 1910. However, despite these personal sacrifices, neither Caddy nor Winnie are able to protect or honor their brothers to any meaningful extent. Instead, the exploitative, victimizing nature of the patriarchal system in both novels infects and corrupts the admittedly essentialist purity of the love that is shared between these siblings. Rather than prevent or counteract the exploitation and victimization that Stevie and Benji suffer at the hands of Verloc and Jason, the fate of Winnie and Caddy effectively mirrors that of their brothers. The ironic tragedies which befall Winnie and Caddy, as they ultimately fail to correct the injustices that Stevie and Benji experience, is doubled, or in keeping with the overlapping sibling motifs in both novels, twinned with the downfall of their poor boys. Both sisters suffered dearly for the futile defense of their brothers. While Caddy remains unmarried, essentially childless, and ultimately doomed to suffer the cruelty of men like Jason, Winnie loses her life as a direct result of the dangerous, secret game Verloc is coerced into playing with his comrades. In closing, Winnie, Stevie, Caddy, and Benji are all enmeshed within the cyclical cruelty that is endemic of patriarchal society and its reliance upon the exploitation of the helpless and the vulnerable. The tragedy of Winnie and Caddy is that they each fall victim to the same forces that fatally exploit the poor boys they are charged with protecting. As Conrad and Faulkner each realized across both sides of the Atlantic, the modern age was nothing if not a bad world for poor people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And again, came in well inside the time. Our next speaker is Michela Maroni, who is Associate Professor of English at the University of Tuscia in Viterbo. I fear I may have mispronounced that. She's the author of 3 books, the first on John Ruskin, the second on how to read published articles and books on Victorian fiction and the history of translation, with particular focus on Sarah Austin, George Eliot, and Eleanor Marx. And she's edited 2 short stories by Elizabeth Gaskell, The Half-Brothers, and Mr. Harrison's Confessions. Her latest book is Dialoghi Tradutologici on Gender and Translation, and she sits on the editorial board of 3 journals on Victorian Studies, Merope, and Tradutologia. Okay, thank you. Michela.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Not terribly clearly, I don't think, for me.
Sorry, I try. Let
That's
me know.
better. That's good. That's good.
Okay. Published in 1898, The Return occupies the place which is usually reserved to exception in Conrad's narrative production. It is well known that at the time Conrad wrote the story, he was still in artistic stage in which an active experimentation with language, genres, and themes was one of his literary priorities. In this connection, Conrad's meeting with Harry James may have oriented his thematic focus on a subject matters involving a psychological study of marital life. The fact remains that many writers have been evoked in order to explain the origin of The Return, which Conrad called a London story, with the explicit intention of stressing the metropolitan nature of its protagonists. Of course, the tradition of the French novel meant a lot for Conrad during his formative years, but is less important than we can suppose. Many presences can be detected behind the writing of this story. Certainly, The Return was also the result of Conrad's wish to expand the horizon of his fiction. This attempt implying an experimental dimension which was partly stimulated by the awareness that a new aesthetic was emerging in those hectic decades. For Conrad, who had shaped his talent by an assiduous reading of French realist fiction, literature meant an unveiling of the hypocrisy that inhabited the domestic space of a bourgeois marriage. Significantly, in a climatic moment of his personal crisis, Hervey realizes that his wife had no love and no faith for anyone. To give your thought, your belief, was like whispering your confession over the edge of the world. Nothing came back, not even an echo. The stress is placed on the word nothing, which became a quintessential definition of his predicament. After finding a letter from his wife informing him that she was left him for the editor of a society paper, the stable world in which Harvey has lived for 5 years undergoes a seismic shock, implying nothingness. For the coeval reading public, as well as for editors and publishers, the treatment of the story seems to align Conrad with Flaubert, Zola, and with those French novelists who in England were considered expression of the most abject sentiments. Because of its subject matter, The Return was rejected by every editor it was submitted to. The story never found a magazine publication, and it was published the following year as one of the 5 stories collected under the title Tales of Unrest. It is no surprise that his friend and mentor, Edward Garnett, found the story very weak. This was Conrad's immediate reply, I'm quoting, "I wanted to produce the effect of insincerity or artificiality. I wanted the reader to see him think and then hear him speak and shudder." In many respects, the writing of The Return was a turning point in Conrad's career. Indeed, not only did he try to experiment with a new technique of representation by an extensive use of free indirect speech, but also he reflected on the significance of the models he most admired and on their bearing in the development of his fiction. No doubt, The Return was the result of more than one model. In this experimental period, Conrad was particularly interested in naturalism. However, it may be the story's closure is marked by a clear allusion to A Doll's House by Ibsen, which evokes the image of a slamming door. After his wife's return, after having supposed that he could resume the old way of life, Halvan Hervey realizes that it is impossible for him to ignore what has happened and to continue in a marriage made of appearances and duplicity. I'm quoting. "No sound came from beyond, not a whisper, not a sigh. She listened with parted lips and resolute eyes. Then below, far below, as if in the entrails of the earth, a door slammed heavily, and the quiet house vibrated to it from roof to foundation, more to a clap of thunder. He never returned." The final words of the story are an explicit quotation from Ibsen's drama. The image of Hervey leaving his wife repeats the scene in which Nora abandons her husband, Torvald Ermer. Indeed, after declaring that she cannot live with a stranger, Nora leaves her husband in order to affirm her new self as an independent woman. The idea of keeping up appearances is now contrary to her new gender awareness. Tellingly, in A Doll's House, the curtain falls not on Elmer's words, but on what is evoked by a meaningful stage direction. I'm quoting, the heavy sound of a door being slammed is heard from below. It stands to reason that Nora's revolt was not only against her husband, who, in his failure to understand, remains on the respectable side of the door. In fact, she slammed the door against a world whose social organization and system of values did not contemplate a full recognition of women's talent and rights. By assuming that a man could repeat the same gesture, Conrad produced a story that in a sociocultural perspective was a real challenge to Ibsen's position as regards women's condition. The fact that Hervey is the agent of revolt against respectability means a lot in terms of interpretation. In this sense, Ibsen seems to be the great model which Conrad intends to challenge on the theme of conjugal life. Admittedly, Conrad is not Ibsen, simply because he would have never subscribed to the ideas staged by the Norwegian dramatist. His notes jotted down in Rome before writing A Doll's House are very explicit, I'm quoting. "A woman cannot be herself in the society of the present day, which is an exclusively masculine society, with laws framed by men and with a judicial system that judges feminine conduct from a masculine point of view." It's evident that from the very first, Ibsen was intent on writing a drama which would highlight the anomalous position of women in a prevailing male-dominated society. It's equally evident that Ibsen himself rejected any form of association between his name and feminism. In private conversation as well as in public declaration, he maintained that Doll's House had nothing to do with the new woman and socialism. He was always ready to downplay the political impact of his work. Still, the simple name Nora became an international catchword to express the image of a woman who, while slamming the door on marriage, declares that a different and more significant role of women is possible. These ideas found followers and admirers in Europe and the States immediately after the publication of the play in Copenhagen in 1879. Its success was immediate and sensational. As Raymond Williams has rightly observed, A Doll's House is now, as it has been, a social rather than a literary phenomenon. Its excitement lay in its relation to feminism, and although Ibsen rejected the ascription of support for feminism, in practical terms, this hardly matters. It is no exaggeration to hold that Doll's House is one of those works whose extraordinary cultural valence goes beyond its artistic sphere. After the fifth London performance of A Doll's House in June 1889, Walter Besant wrote a story, The Doll's House and After, in which he imagines Nora's life after 20 years since her decision of slamming the door on middle-class domesticity. In his reactionary vision, the writer features a mature Nora who can live decently by novel writing. Here, it may be interesting to notice that in the wake of the success of Ibsen's play in 1990, the American novelist Edna Cheney wrote a short story, which was a sort of narrative reply to Bestant's negative portrait of Nora in her artistic maturity. Leaving aside the plot, structure, and culmination in equal marriage, we cannot overlook that the title of Cheney's story was Nora's Return. Thus, Conrad's title is a replica of Cheney's without the heroine's name. In my view, it would be not be wrong to describe Conrad's London story in a context characterized by a lively debate on marriage, feminism, and Ibsen reception in England. In this sense, Conrad's position seems to be more on the side of Besant's than on the Cheney's. Indeed, even though the portrait of Alvan Hervey is not by no means that of an ideal husband, the story is narrated almost in its entirety by assuming his point of view. On the other hand, when Conrad abandons the technique of free indirect discourse, his scathing irony is leveled mainly on Mrs. Hervey. Actually, she's portrayed as a sort of anti-Nora, both physically and intellectually, I'm quoting, she strode like a grenadier, was strong and upright like an obelisk. The trope of the obelisk as a solid and emotionless public object is an anticipation of the reiterated definition as a woman of marble. It seems obvious that Conrad's characterization of Mrs. Hervey in itself heavily negative, as well as conveying a tone of sarcastic treatment of her skin-deep opinions, the narrator expresses a subdued contempt for a way of being in a society, while a particular emphasis is put on her misplaced ambition. A passage taken from the first part of the Return reveals her limitation. I'm quoting. Alvan Hervey and his wife spent 5 years of prudent bliss, unclouded with any doubts as to the moral propriety of their existence. She, to give her individuality fair play, took up all manner of philanthropic work and became a member of various rescuing and reforming society patronized or presided over by ladies of title. Tellingly, the image of prudent bliss is symptomatic of a world in which spontaneity and truth have no room. The notion of prudence, in fact, implies a restraint in every sort of action, public and private. The marriage, as staged by Conrad, is an institution made of masks. Under the best condition of their daily life, it's apparent that the change of mask suffices to give substance to their conjugal bliss, while a high degree of self-restraint is a guarantee of their stability in the sphere of their social life. But the foundation on which they are built, their marriage, are by no means as solid as they imagine. When his remorseful wife comes back home in defeat, Mr. Hervey cannot stand the idea that she is a woman who has lost her self-control, a woman who has rejected the idea of a mask as a protection against the risk of discontinuity and the temptation of external world. I'm quoting. Self-restraint is everything in life, you know. Its happiness, its dignity, is everything. In Hervey's view, then, self-restraint is a defense against all kinds of horrors, but this self-protecting strategy evokes an immobility, a negation of feeling, a coldness in the human relationships, which transform individual existence into a statuesque stillness and rigidity. In this sense, Mrs. Hervey can be symbolically equated to the statue exhibited in the house. The words used, marble, stone, lifeless, blindly, rigid, are the same words that will be adopted by Hervey to describe his unfaithful wife during his long monologues. Ultimately, Mr. Hervey, the woman without a name, can be regarded actually as a figure whose action negates what Nora instead affirms in her personality. The former is a woman superficial, egoistic, without any real feeling for her husband, as well as for her friends. The latter is the embodiment of self-sacrifice, courage, and self-realization that entails no wearing of masks. Above all, in her choice, Nora rejects the self-restraint, which, according to Alva Hervey's Victorian orthodoxy, is the key to happiness and dignity and everything in life. I'm closing. The fact that Mr. Hervey will leave home after a return, in my opinion, may be read as a challenge by Conrad to the cultural paradigm embodied by Ibsen's heroine. The last three words of the story are, "He never returned," and they seem to abandon the nameless woman to her destiny of a social death and cultural sterility. Thank you.
Much. Our last speaker is June Ward, who is a second-year PhD student at the University of Northumbria. His work explores the presentation of domestic space in the colonial fiction of Joseph Conrad and his contemporaries, including Hugh Clifford, Leonard Woolf, and Louis Beck. Jim, thank you. Can we? I think you're muted, Jim. Could you unmute yourself? There you are. I think you're. No, you're still mute. No, I think you're unmuted now. Can you speak?
Yes, hello?
Right, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Okay, I'll get on with this then. In 1895, Joseph Conrad published his first novel, Almayer's Folly. Whilst the reception of the work was generally favourable, some critics were dissatisfied with the image of the colonial frontier which Conrad presented, believing it lacked the colour and drama of popular imperial romance. A contemporary review in the Bookman suggested that the slow, vague, mysterious East has cast its spell over Mr. Conrad, with results not conducive to the interests of the volatile European reader. To this reviewer, the novel had failed to satisfy the kinds of expectations fueled by the popular fiction of the day. In the author's note to the novel, written at the time of publication, but only published in a later edition of the novel in 1921, Conrad expresses a critical attitude to this kind of reductive way of thinking about the East. Quote, "The critic and the judge seems to think that in those distant lands, all joy is a yell and a war dance, all pathos is a howl and a ghastly grin of filed teeth, and that the solution of all problems is found in the barrel of a revolver or on the point of an assegai. And yet it is not so." Despite this, Conrad presents us with a story in the lagoon which appears to conform to the very qualities he seemed to disavow. Azat's tale of love and betrayal, which is the centerpiece of the lagoon, presents the romanticized image of the exotic East that was commonly found in the popular adventure fiction of the day, much as the relationship between the trader and his Malay friend was a familiar feature of imperial romance. As Linda Dryden notes, the native subject of imperial romance and adventure is a simple soul, trusting the superior moral, political, and cultural power attributed to the white hero. Critics tend to agree, however, that if Conrad sometimes utilised generic images of non-Europeans, he placed some critical distance between himself and these modes of representation to question contemporary thinking about the use of non-European cultures in fiction. Okay. As is well known, not all critics have accepted that the formal aspects of Conrad's work complicate any straightforward reading of the author's intended meaning. Chinua Achebe memorably concluded that there was no discernible or excusable difference between the views of Marlowe and the author in Heart of Darkness. Daphne Erdnas-Fulken claims that The Lagoon exhibits all the symptoms of primitivist discourse, marking a sharp division between the Western white observer and the native who turns into an object of curiosity and knowledge, deploying the tropology of mysticism and magic, presenting the native hero as emotional, childlike, and untamed. In seeing in The Lagoon all the signs of primitivist discourse, Daphne Erdnas-Fulken draws on a well-established structuralist mode which identifies the various strategies of representation which underline distinct and essential differences based on ethnicity. Accordingly, she isolates the various binary oppositions which occur in the text between white observer and native as object of curiosity and knowledge, between right rationality and native magic and superstition. Yet in demonstrating how the story conforms to this Orientalist or primitivist model, there is much that Fulken ignores. For example, the European perspective is objectified in the narrative rather than privileged. If the non-Europeans are subjected to an Orientalist treatment, then, as Robert Hampson notes, the unnamed European is subjected to what might be termed an Occidentalist treatment. Quote, "The white man gazed straight before him into the darkness with wide open eyes. The fear and fascination, the inspiration and the wonder of death soothed the unrest of his race." Furthermore, in foregrounding the antipathy between the crew and Azat based on his status as a stranger and on his transgressive practices in occupying an abandoned house, Conrad indicates the plurality of ideas and cultures contained within that constructed category of Malay. To overlook these important details is to fail to recognize Conrad's engagement with and critical distance from the primitivist discourses associated with imperial romance and to which Fulken suggests the text adheres. Of the Malays on board the boat, Fulken writes, "The local people, presented through what appears to be free indirect discourse, are universalized stereotypes of primitive natives." Certainly, Conrad provides us with only the sparest of details of the crew, a steersman who only grunts when asked to steer a course for the lagoon and wields a flashing blade in a semicircle above his head, and a surly Juragan who is fearful of the spirits that haunt Azat's hut. The depiction of the crew offers little in the way of a more complex picture of indigenous people. But by assigning some significance to what the crew do, rather than simply how they are represented in the story, we might consider how this troubles Fulken's claim that those on board simply reiterate a reductive and derogatory stereotype. To do so requires an alternative approach which avoids the limitations of Said's or Orientalist or Fulken's primitivist framework, and which looks instead for equivalence or similarity in the actions and behaviours of individuals. If we read The Lagoon from a perspective that emphasises individual agency, we can avoid the sort of approach which makes generalised conclusions based on representations of race. In this respect, the work of Michel de Certeau is valuable in offering ways to think about the significance of individual practices which determine the kind of spaces individuals inhabit. I suggest that reading The Lagoon with these ideas in mind takes us closer to a fuller appreciation of the multi-layered and deconstructive nature of the lagoon. In the book, The Practice of Everyday Life, de Certeau makes a distinction between place and space. A place, he suggests, excludes the possibility of two things being in the same location. A place is an instantaneous configuration of positions. It implies an indication of stability. A place, therefore, is the physical object, the house, the garden, the street, the living room, the boat, measurable and inhabitable. Space, on the other hand, exists when one takes into consideration vectors of direction, velocities and time variables. It is, in a sense, actuated by the ensemble of movements deployed within it. In relation to place, space is like the word when it is spoken. By these terms, space is determined by the actions of historical subjects. Places which appear to have a fixed function and identity become transformed into various kinds of space through the actions or behaviours which happen within their designated boundaries. As Desserteau suggests, space is a practiced place. Thus, the street geometrically defined by urban planning is transformed into a space by walkers. Desserteau therefore offers a useful way of thinking about how places, rather than having a preordained value or status, are actually produced through the actions of individuals. This has key significance in the colonial context because it puts the emphasis on domesticity as process, as opposed to domesticity as an essential attribute of a particular race or people. In the book Imperial Leather, Anne McClintock draws our attention to the etymology of the verb to domesticate. Domesticity denotes both a space and a social relation to power. Etymologically, the verb to domesticate is akin to dominate, which derives from dominus, lord of the domum, the home. Until very recently, however, the verb to domesticate also carries as one of its meanings the action to civilize. Domestication was seen as part of the process of civilizing colonized peoples, and as McClintock's definition makes clear, derives from the idea of domination. But Desserteau's focus on individual agency troubles any form of colonial discourse which suggests that one race is essentially domesticated and others are not. His distinction between place and space draws our attention to how space can be appropriated for a particular purpose. It puts significance on the user of that space and how places can be repurposed despite their official or intended function. It invites us to think of the meanings that are created by individuals within those physical boundaries. The idea that domestic spaces are produced as a consequence of something we do rather than something that we are unsettles the privileged status of the colonizer. For example, upon arrival at their destination, the trader leaves his boat to mount the bamboo platform in front of Azad's home. The crew, reluctant to remain in close proximity to the hut, choose to stay on board. Quote, "The juragan of the boat said sulkily, 'We will cook in the sampan and sleep on the water.'" Conrad makes an important distinction between the crew's conception of the boat and that of the narrator. The vessel previously described by the narrator as the white man's canoe is called a sampan by the juragan, which attributes a degree of discursive agency to the Malayan crewman. It undermines the authority of the third-person narrative voice, which describes the boat in terms of European ownership, and instead presents an alternative perspective in which the crew define themselves and their spaces in their own terms. Of further significance is that the crew make a fire, cook, eat, converse, and sleep on board, transforming the boat into a discrete domestic space at the moment of conscious separation from their white superior. At the same time, after retreating from the interior of the hut in which the stricken Diamelan lays dying, the trader takes his supper from a basket, gathers sticks to make a fire to ward off mosquitoes, wraps himself in a blanket, and has a smoke. His actions impose order on the environment and create a barrier between himself and the external space of nature. These simple gestures also convert the romantic space of the lagoon, haunted by the voices which call to Diamelan from the water, into a domestic space, reassuringly mundane and familiar. The trader divests this space of its strangeness. Whilst this forms part of Conrad's subsequent distancing from the romantic mode of Azad's tale, the significant point is that one space is neither more or less domesticated than the other, but that these domestic spaces come into being through the actions of individuals. Conrad's depiction of these distinct spaces troubles a critical model which would deem one group of people civilized and another primitive. There are further examples in the story which trouble this primitivist model. Anne McClintock claims that in colonial discourse, indigenous peoples are symbolically displaced into a zone which she terms anachronistic space. Colonized people do not inhabit history proper, but exist in a permanently anterior time within the geographic space of the modern empire as anachronistic humans, atavistic, irrational, bereft of human agency. There are a number of ways that Conrad appears to both engage with and challenge this aspect of stereotypical discourse in the lagoon. At the opening of the story, the boat transporting the unnamed white trader and his Malay crew appears to enter a different order of time. They are described as entering, quote, the portals of a land from which the very memory of motion had forever departed. Further references to a non-specific past as focalized first through the trader, who recalls that he had known Arzat years ago in a far country in times of trouble and danger, and then Arzat, who thinks back on the time of trouble and war. These phrases, with their particular native inflections, appear to describe a form of non-European time. One way of reading these examples would be to see them as Conrad's ironic appropriation of generic conventions. Vulcan reads them more literally. Quote, it is as though the story takes place in some mythical region beyond history, beyond the experience of the white observer or that of the reader. Yet we might consider how the houseboat which contains the Malay crew reminds us of the existence of a second order of time which coexists within the narrative. It is one of a number of instances in which Conrad disrupts the neat opposition between white and Malay by situating the indigenous characters in the story in different spaces, different temporalities, and even different generic modes. In the moments before Arzat recounts his tale to the trader, and we are taken back in time to an idealized world of romance, they are momentarily distracted. Far away on the lagoon, they could hear the voices of the boatmen ringing fitful and distinct on the calm water. The fire in the bows of the sampan shone faintly in the distance with a hazy red glow. Then it died out. The voices ceased. Rather than existing in what McClintock refers to as anachronistic space, the Malay crew are evidently living and breathing in the present moment, set firmly in time and place, in contrast to the non-specific location and time of Arzat's tale. The crew's domestic routines are oriented around the working day, which is governed by the demands of the imperial market, in contrast to Arzat, who appears eternally fixed in a time of trouble and war. Conrad's depiction of indigenous peoples is therefore split spatially between the anachronistic and the domestic present, and serves to deconstruct the kind of racial stereotyping which would ordinarily present the other country as set within an earlier stage of Western progress. Like the Malabar House Hotel Globetrotters in Lord Jim, the Malay crew are implicated in a world of commerce, and their presence, whilst unobtrusive in comparison to the commercial tourists of Lord Jim, produces a similar point of contrast between the everyday domestic world and the idealized world of romance. The tourists and the occupants of the boat appear to signify the loss of ideals which Jim and Arzat holds dear. The Malay crew therefore offer an alternative representation of indigenous people as bound by the everyday rather than as the projection of imperial desire. In 1897, Charles L. Graves wrote to Conrad on behalf of the editor of the Cornhill magazine, inviting Conrad to submit his short stories. Quote, it is very unlikely he should decline anything you sent him. Conrad's first submission, The Idiots, was rejected. And when, as Lawrence Graver notes, the Cornhill requested something more characteristic of his exotic style, Conrad tried to reproduce the tangled landscapes of his Malayan novels. This concession to the editors of the Cornhill appears to explain Conrad's description of the story to Edward Garnett. It's a tricky thing, with lots of rivers, stars, wind, sunrise, and so on, and lots of second-hand Conradese in it. It would be easy to accept Conrad's dismissal of the story as pastiche, but the catch for us, as much as for Conrad, is its trickiness. Tricky implies the story is not quite so easy or so simple as his flippant dismissal suggests. Recalling Conrad's earlier appeal for more nuanced representations of the Far East in his note to Almayer's Folly, we might surmise that in writing something exotic for Cornhill, Conrad had to negotiate tricky tensions between romantic expectations and a desire to honour the agency of that humanity so far away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have about a little over 15 minutes for questions to those four fascinating papers. And right. I'm not quite sure how to do this. Sometimes there's an option at the bottom of the screen to put your virtual hand up, but that doesn't seem to be available to us. So perhaps if you could put your real hand, I can then see who wants to ask the question. I slip about amongst you. And of course, you're also there is the option of putting your question on the chat board. Yeah, Angela.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah?
Can everyone else?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, congratulations to each and every one of the speakers, and thank you for your thought-provoking papers. I've got a question for Michela. Michela Maroni, for Professor Maroni. Perhaps it is a generic question, but given the importance and the peculiarities of the female character featured in The Return, which is, do you think, I mean, which is, in your opinion, Conrad's view on women in The Return?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Angelo, thank you for your question. Of course, I did not intend represent in my paper Conrad as a writer who rejected women's emancipation and feminism. What I intended to show was the contrast between Conrad and Ibsen in the representation. To put in George Eliot's words, the representation of the common yearning of womanhood. According to Shaw, feminism meant a new school of theatre and a new way of interpreting women's role in society. From the textual evidence, it is clear that Mrs. Hervey is represented as a woman devoid of a real drive towards self-realization, devoid of a real sensibility and culture. Her life is a life made of masks, as I said. In this sense, Conrad offers a portrayal, indeed negative, of the story's female protagonist. It goes without saying that female characters are a minority in Conrad's fiction, especially if we consider novelists such as Henry James or Thomas Hardy, for whose heroines are represented in their psychological and social complexity. But the fact that Conrad had no gallery of heroines is not a consequence of his ideological refutation on women's significance in fiction. It's simply, I think, a matter of literary imagination. That's if it's, I don't know if it is clear.
Anthony, I see your hand. You need to unmute yourself.
Mute. Unmute.
Unmute. I think, no.
Is that okay now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, great. This is a question mainly for Peter. The Conrad Orwell difference about imperialism. I was wondering about two things. One is the fact, I mean, they had very thoroughly different backgrounds, as you pointed out, but it doesn't seem to me that that is irrelevant, because Conrad felt himself, it was a third language he's writing in, or speaking in, and he always felt himself to be something like a foreigner. And people like Woolf were very kind of superiorly ironic about his pronunciation, his speech. Now, it seems to me that when he was writing, he displaced a criticism of British imperialism, even in Heart of Darkness, which I understand you didn't want to talk about, onto, you know, the British, at least, he was implying, do better work there in the Congo. But my main point there is that Orwell was brought up in one of those powerful political schools in the country that produced God knows how many prime ministers. So Orwell had a great training in confidence. And therefore, even though he, to some extent, rebelled against the ethos, the political ethos of Eton, he had the confidence to criticize it. Conrad was in a much more vulnerable position, particularly where he was publishing his works, which were heavily imperialistic, or publishing very imperialistic kinds of stories, a lot earlier. So in a way, to put them together as if they were enjoying a contemporaneous problem seems to me to be a bit problematic. The second point is that that time difference between the 1890s through the war, First World War, where there was obviously racism, but it was much more thought to be implicit. As you argue, Peter, Orwell's actual direct experience in the Indian police made that much more obvious, as well as the historical moment of absolutely explicit racism with the rise of fascism, under which conditions Orwell was largely writing. So there seemed to me, although I understood the argument you were making, these background histories, if you like, which need to be taken into consideration. Is Peter there?
Peter, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting points, Anthony. It's interesting about Orwell that we don't know what he sounded like because the BBC didn't keep records of his voice. But the reports are that he was a very confident man, as you say, an Oldetonian who knew the background that he came from.
Yeah.
Although to some extent he rebelled against it in the Road to Wigan Pier and so on.
Yes. That's
Conrad himself was also very proud of his background because when he was offered a knighthood, he said, "I'm already a member of the Polish Szlachta. I don't need your knighthood." As to, yes, one can over-compare the two, but I think you raise interesting points. Thank you.
Robert, are you raising your hand?
No.
No, just stretching, okay.
Can I?
Yeah, sorry. Andrew, yes?
Yeah. I have a question for Peter. Given that Orwell, as you said, and his experience in Burma wrote that he was all for the Burmese and all against the British oppressors, I'd like to know if you consider Conrad's and Orwell's view of imperialism in terms of their respective biographies. They can be regarded as two outsiders, but with different cultural roots.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite grasp all of that.
Do I have to repeat again?
Just a few words, Michaela.
Okay, sorry. Given that Orwell and his experience in Burma wrote that he was all for Burmese and all against their British oppressors, I'd like to know if you consider Conrad's and Orwell's view of imperialism in terms of their respective biographies. They can be regarded, in your opinion, as two outsiders, but with different cultural roots?
I think Orwell's experience in Burma showed how essentially honest he was because he portrays both his dislike for colonialism and imperialism and the difficulties of being an imperial and police officer. And I often wonder whether he was actually a prefect at Eton. I don't know if they have prefects at Eton, but his attitude, in some extent, in some of his novels and his journalism, implies that the Burmese are actually quite childish and that they ought to behave better. And if you look at Shooting an Elephant, which is in one way one of his best essays, he says at the end, the reason why I shot the elephant, I paraphrase, was because I didn't wish to look a fool. And that's a wonderful statement about the imperial attitude.
Yeah, it is.
And if I go back to Conrad just for a moment, I'm minded of the fact that when Conrad was captain of a ship, in his brief experience of captaincy in the Merchant Navy. When he visited Mauritius, he was known as the Russian Count. Well, what does that tell us? He must have been horrified if he heard that.
Yeah.
But he had the instincts of a gentleman.
Yeah.
And Andrew, you had a question, didn't you? I think you need to unmute if you do.
Right, has that done it?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, this was just a point regarding your paper, Jim, which I thought was fascinating. And your notion, your thesis about Malays, and I dare say people from other ethnic groups represented in Conrad are seen in the various ways in which Conrad represents them in a light that's not entirely an imperial or European light, not just through those eyes. And it just occurred to me, and I don't know if you've thought about this, you may well have done, that the flickers that we get throughout the Malay fiction about Malay history, particularly the very, very long-running history of resistance to colonialism, perhaps also, they certainly do in my mind, sort of support your thesis quite strongly about there being an existence, a mode of thinking, a manner of living and believing in things which are really quite outside the Europeans. And one of my favorite minor characters, who I think I referred to yesterday, is Jurgensen, the sort of rather indeterminate Nordic man who was present at the taking of Sinkel and fought in the Padri Wars. And his involvement in those contests is, I think, entirely on behalf of the Malays. So if you like, in the representation of that European, he is subsumed and put into the hands of the Malays for whom who he valued so much that he thought demanded his unquestioning support. I mean, it left him amongst, well, and so did other things, left him a very disillusioned man, but a man still of fierce beliefs and honesty. And there are lots of other examples of various wars in Southeast Asia, of course, and not just in in Indonesia. But I just wondered if that had gone through your mind as well.
Well, not that specific connection, but certainly I did spend a fair bit of time trying to identify who exactly these people might be, because the location of the lagoon, the setting, is actually, it's not very specific. It's not that easy to identify exactly where it is, even though these people are clearly local to the area, because the Arzat character is a stranger, but that there's still no more clues in there. So I was trying to identify, is it possible to specify, that Conrad was actually doing something very realistic and grounded historically with but I couldn't find it. But yeah, certainly the idea of the fact that their mobility, I think, is really significant. And when I began to look at the history, that there was clearly a record of a mobile nomadic population that had a presence and political power and influence, but were hard to be contained within kind of Western modes of representation, if you like. They kind of evaded just Western representations. Is something that Robert talks a lot about in the opening chapter of the cross-cultural encounters of the Bugis and their presence in the area. Anyway, so I'm not really answering your question, but yeah, it was something that I thought about a lot and learned a lot about, but ultimately it was just, it kind of opened up a real, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole with that, and there's so much speculation, you know, but yeah, it was fascinating to just try and follow that path of who are these people actually, can they be located, and what are the little clues that Conrad gives us, where does that lead us? But so yes.
John, you'll need to unmute yourself first.
I think I'm unmuted, am I?
Yes, you are.
It's just a thought about Orwell, and does Orwell criticise his privileged background? I don't know how many people know about the essay he wrote in Horizon in 1940, attacking the public school stories in The Gem and the Magnet, written by Frank Richards. Orwell got the shock of his life when Richards responded 2 months later and proceeded to show more scholarship than Orwell had. It's interesting that one of the magnets he was specifically criticising, though he didn't mention the cover, has on the cover Billy Bunter looking at the picture, looking at a pig's head, and it says Bunter's the one with the specs. And there's a book by Owen Dudley Edwards about British children's literature in the Second World War that suggests that this might have been in Orwell's mind when he wrote The End of Animal Farm. But it's just a thought about the Orwell, the public school boy, criticising stories about public schools.
Thank you. Anyone else? There may be questions on the chat, but I can't access the chat at the moment for some reason or another.
Could I ask Ahmed something?
Yeah, Nick. Yeah.
Sorry, everybody's raising their hand at the same time. Yeah. You're an interesting comparison, Ahmed. I think it would make a good case there for looking at these two characters together, as well as the general influence. Definitely, there's no doubt about that. About autism, though, I think that I think that Conrad. I mean, I'm not familiar with Faulkner, but I think Conrad certainly admires Stevie, but I don't think he wants to idealize him as much as you're suggesting, perhaps. Because he sees the kind of excess in sensibility, which it doesn't have a lack of sensibility, it has an excess of sensibility, as perhaps Benji has. Yeah, is that right? Yeah, and he sees that as obviously. I mean, this is a rare quality that modern subjects lack, and so Stevie is hypersensitive, is hyper aware, and all this kind of stuff. Morally, kind of sensitive and all that kind of stuff. But I think that as a social being, this actually places him at a disadvantage. So Conrad is aware of the need to balance this this hypersensitivity with perhaps shall we say a kind of a lessened essentialism. He's kind of too essentialist. He sees things too much. Too essential from too essentialist a perspective, and that renders him socially an outcast. But the main point I want to make was what you said about the symbolic order, which is I don't think that with the case of autism, if we look at it from a Lacanian point of view, I don't think that autistic people are placed on the margins of the symbolic order. If you look at it from Lacan's point of view, they themselves cannot enter the symbolic order. It's not that they are pushed out, it's that they are they're not functioning within that, if you like, trope.
Sure, and I don't necessarily believe or sort of subscribe to sort of either Stevie or Benji being you have to say they're autistic or they're any sort of form of this one specific kind of disability. I completely agree, and I do think that in both cases with Stevie and with Benji, there's a sense that Faulkner more so than Conrad does makes Benji incredibly vulnerable and incredibly sympathetic. Like he's sort of aiming for your heartstrings, really, whereas with Conrad, I think he's more looking at it from a pragmatic point of view, the fact that because of Stevie's emotions, he's left, as I say in the paper, at sort of vulnerable to the hands of people like Furlock. But that doesn't necessarily, I don't think he's trying to sort of essentialize him as much as as Faulkner does with Benji. So I take your point, and that's one of the things that I'll sort of aim to sort of refine a little bit when I turn this into, because my aim is to turn this into an article eventually. But so thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We need to stop now so we can take our coffee, tea, and bathroom breaks. Thank you very much for a very most interesting conversation. We'll see you again in 8 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay. Robert, are you okay for the next? Or is everyone going to have coffee?
Yes.
Okay.
I upgraded my Zoom last night.
Oh.
And Galinda stayed off and seems to be okay. So far, it seems to be okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, everyone's checked their sharing screen, so I think that's all fine. I don't know if Tanya checked it. I think she might have gone to get a coffee. Oh, Xiaoling.
I'm here, Kim. Sorry.
Yes. Oh, right, you're there, Tanya. Yao Xiaoling, can you hear me? No, she was.
Oh, yeah. Ah. I'm here.
Okay, do you need to check your sharing screen? Do you have a PowerPoint?
No, I don't have a PowerPoint.
Oh, that's fine.
So I don't have to check the sharing.
That's fine. Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
All right then, so I'll see you, well, if everyone needs to go and get a coffee, we'll just be back in about 5 minutes time then.
Okay then. Yeah, okay.
I'm conscious that it's 3:30, but I'm still waiting to get a signal from Kim. Kim?
I'm here.
Do you want me to start the second session?
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely, it's 3:30, so yeah, we're better.
Yeah. Right, it's my great pleasure to introduce the second panel for this afternoon. We have 5 speakers, so I'm hoping that everyone will keep to time. I doubt if I'll be able to send chat messages, but I've brought with me what I was told was a very elaborate chronometer, which I'll use to set for the 15 minutes for each paper. The first speaker is going to be Ketevan Yamukhadze. She gained a master's degree for her thesis on evolution of quest myth in modernism and postmodernism, which used the examples of Heart of Darkness and John Fowles' Ebony Tower. And she presented part of this thesis at the 46th Annual International Conference in London in 2019. So some of us will remember her from that. She's currently a doctoral student of English Studies at Tbilisi State University with a main specialization on English literature. The subject matter of her doctoral thesis is the city as a mythical space in the modern novel. And today she's going to talk about cityscape in The Secret Agent. So over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Professor Hempson. So I will start. In a work of art, specific time and space in which the action takes place is usually defined by an author. Writer creates a fictional world within which the characters are positioned and the plot unfolds. In literary theory, chronotype is the term describing how configurations of time and space are represented in language. And the introduction of this term is associated with the name of Mikhail Bakhtin. Naturally, chronotype of a fictional text has changed over time. Thus, it is interesting to see how this change would affect the spatial characteristics of the work. For example, fictional space of the novels of the representatives of the 19th century English literature, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, is home, where all the important events take place and rarely go beyond its threshold. Home is a kind of closed space which allows its dwellers, characters, to be isolated from society, to hide from public, whether it's urban or rural. In modernism, which has brought new aesthetics, the area of action mostly shifts from home to streets. In a modern novel, home is no longer a clearly demarcated place where where essential events take place. In this case, the previously clearly defined boundary between private and public space is almost completely blurred. This, of course, does not mean that characters of modern works are much more open to the surrounding world and society. A character of a modern novel wanders in the streets, frequently visits various social spaces, interacts with public. However, during the interaction, in a paradoxical sense, his isolation is seen even clearer. He cannot come to terms with modern space as it is in Joyce's Ulysses. Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus meet lots of people during the day while wandering in Dublin streets. The narration takes place mainly outside in the public spaces of the city, which together with the community gathered there are unfamiliar to them. At the same time, they do not feel comfortable at home. And it's noteworthy that Stephen Dedalus does not even have a permanent shelter. Joseph Conrad clearly does not belong to any of these conditional categories, the fictional space of the secret agent is London. The action takes place in closed space in the Verloc's house shop, as well as in the city streets. For example, the central event of the narrative, the explosion, takes place in a crowded park. However, home is the very place where the secret agent breeds the idea of how to carry out the task of terrorist attack. Also, for the crime committed, Winnie Verloc kills her husband in their own house. Although the novel's crucial storyline unfolds within the walls of the house, Conrad consciously blurs the line between home and city streets and allows such a large city as London to intrude its invisible hands everywhere. While home for the Bronte sisters is a kind of fortress and its walls have a protective function for the characters from the outside world, home in The Secret Agent is not a shelter. Moreover, the part of the building which is said to be the Verloc's home is actually a shop, which immediately gives the reader a sense of the absence of a homely atmosphere. This feeling is exacerbated by the fact that the door of the shop is always suspiciously ajar, which should indicate that the home environment in Conrad's fictional space merges with the atmosphere of the city streets. The city dweller's life, writes Franco Moretti, is dominated by a nightmare, a trifling one, to be sure, unknown to other human beings, the terror of missing something. A city intensifies the feeling that people are constantly surrounded by new opportunities and challenges that need to be kept up with. There is a strong feeling that something happens in every street and alley, behind every door, something that we miss out on, and lives go on and changes without us. Consequently, the city makes its inhabitants feel euphoric, which calls them to continuous action. It seems to Adolf Verloc shares the same situation. His status is of diverse nature: a family man, a pornographic trader, an anarchist, a foreign secret spy, and local police agent at the same time. It's therefore natural to have uncertainty about the issue of true pursuit of his ideologies or beliefs. If we take literary scholar Geraldine Van Horn's opinion as an example, it seems that such life should be caused by scopes of the city and its magnitude, and accelerated pace of life contribute to the main character of the novel and provides for his diversity. Quote, in the country, a person is a farmer, a merchant, or a clergyman and cannot escape this status because everyone knows him as such. But in the city, there exists the chance to live more than one life. Only in the city is such a life possible because the city size allows one to move unnoticed from one world to another. unquote. The Werlock's house shop is full of indifference. Conrad gives readers an opportunity to have a look in the couple's bedroom as well, where there is nothing but alienation and unspoken words, and where only a sound of a ticking clock breaks the silence. The most important, practically the only characteristic of the main female character of the novel, Winnie Werlock, is that she does not interfere in anything, does not ask questions, and is always silent. Nothing arouses interest or curiosity in her. As an exception, the object of her love and care is her own brother, Stevie. However, at the end of the novel, readers doubt this. After Adolf Werlock's violent act is revealed, Winnie's original unspoken and tragic condition is changed by the sudden realization that Stevie's absence will bring her complete freedom. However, this sudden feeling of joy is soon replaced by fear and the knowledge that the freedom needs to be used properly. Winnie realizes that she needs to leave the house immediately, but the vagueness beyond the threshold frightens and threatens her. Quote, Mrs. Werlock was a free woman, for she did not exactly know what use to make of her freedom. Her personality seemed to have been torn into two pieces whose mental operations did not adjust themselves very well to each other. It can be said that for Winnie Werlock, the house has always played the role of a hiding place or a shelter within the walls of which she finds her comfort zone, and current events in the outside world do not threaten her serenity. There comes a moment in the novel when Conrad's female character feels the need to escape and save herself after the murder of her husband, and this is the very moment when readers see a helpless and frightened woman for whom going out and gaining temporary freedom only brings death. Daring to cross the threshold of the house, the streets make her disorientated, and the whole city is associated with death. Quote, the street frightened her since it led either to the gallows or to the river, unquote. London becomes a huge, brutal space that threatens to swallow and destroy her. As Geraldine Van Horn points out, what unites Conrad's characters in sameness is their urbanism. They share the same values dictated by the city. The researcher names this characteristic as striving for material well-being, comfort, and social status. Interestingly, Conrad does not draw a clear line between anarchists and law enforcement. On the contrary, they even intersect with each other. Therefore, terrorists and those who support the truth are two sides of the same coin. The only character who is disconnected and stands apart from them is Stevie, who is mentally handicapped according to the author's ironic decision. When talking about Stevie's character, we should definitely mention the archetypal symbol circle. Conrad's mentally impaired character repeatedly appears in a state of disconnection from the world, during which time he continuously paints circles. The author resembles the innumerable tangled circles he draws to cosmic chaos. Quote, the innocent Stevie seated very good and quiet at the deal table, drawing circles, innumerable circles, concentric, eccentric, a coruscating whirl of circles that suggested a rendering of cosmic chaos, the symbolism of a mad art, attempting the inconceivable. Stevie reminds us of Faulkner's mentally impaired Benji and Nave Vardaman. Conrad's as well as Faulkner's characters perceive the world as a primary entity at the level of sensations and instincts. They do not have the ability to analyze, to comprehend the essence of things and events. Yet their naive and unblemished view of the world is sincere. Faulkner shows special affection for these characters, and it can't be accidental that Stevie is gifted by Conrad with the ability to link with the separate primordial world of intensified senses where pragmatism dictated by London lifestyle cannot intrude. The novel, however, reveals that a character like Stevie is unable to maintain a connection to the material and intangible worlds at the same time, leaving no place for him in the city. Quite a lot of writers assign the role of truth tellers to a weak-minded or mentally ill character. Returning to Faulkner's example in the novel As I Lay Dying, Darl Bandren appears as an omniscient figure for whom nothing is hidden and who knows both the secret affairs of his family members and the mysteries of the world. It's he who realizes that the absurdity of the procession arranged to bury his mother. Darl does not go unpunished, and at the end of the novel, he is presented to the reader as a mentally ill person. Like Faulkner, Joseph Conrad offers chaotic circles drawn by mentally impaired Stevie as a visual solution to the disorder that reigns in London, as if the world is like a cosmic chaos in the mind of a mad artist. Significantly, Conrad chose space of a city to represent such an universal disorder, and he decided this city to be London, the heart of the empire. The reason might be the idea that the center is usually a place where fundamental principles are established and then disseminated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Excellent timing. Thank you. The second speaker in this panel is Agnieszka Adamowicz-Pospiech, who is an associate professor of English literature and translation studies at the University of Silesia in Katowice in Poland. She's published 3 books on British modernism, 2 books on translation, and over 80 articles on Browning, Shaw, T.S. Eliot, Conrad, Joyce, Golding, Pinter, and others. Her research focuses on descriptive translation studies, on British modernism, on modern and contemporary British drama, and she's currently involved in the project, the Transcultural Conrad. Today, she's talking about the visual presentation of the Wędrowiec, The Wanderer magazine. So Agnieszka, over to you.
Thank you, Robert. First, I'd like to thank Kim, Mary, Robert, Hugh for organizing this meeting, conference, and for us, giving us the possibility to come together, to see one another, and to enjoy listening to the papers and asking questions, being together in spite of the circumstances. My presentation today dovetails with Helen Chambers' paper yesterday, in that it focuses on digital newspapers archives and bases on contextual historical research, hopefully for broadening Conrad studies. And now I'd like to show you my presentation. Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So the title of my paper, as you said, is the visual presentation of the Wędrowiec magazine. I don't know what would have become of me if I had not been a reading boy. It was with these words that Conrad recalled the difficult months during which he was left to his own devices as his father Apollo Korzeniowski was dying in Krakow. As we know, Conrad was an avid reader, not only of books, but also of magazines. One, which he almost certainly read on a regular basis and which was remembered by his friends, was a weekly called Wędrowiec, The Wanderer. The aim of the presentation is to give a general outline of the text that the young Conrad could have read in this travel magazine, and to show some of the illustrations that accompanied them. The Wędrowiec magazine. Wędrowiec was a periodical which originally dealt with the subjects of travel and geography, but which later also touched on social, cultural, and political themes. It was launched by Józef Unger and was published in Warsaw from 1863 to 1906. Its full title was Wędrowiec, a magazine publishing accounts of voyages and expeditions, combined with descriptions of the habits and customs of foreign peoples, the lives of famous foreigners, stories from and translations of foreign literature. The title of this magazine is mentioned twice in the recollections of Jadwiga Kałuska. She was a friend of Conrad in Lwów, and in the letters of Bobrowski. Conrad must have read the magazine many a time and in quite a few different places, given that his friends and relatives remembered its title. Wędrowiec was a lively, well-edited weekly. It reprinted and translated a number of articles from the French travel journal Le Tour du Monde, and generally followed its editorial principles and layout, together with its elaborate engravings. It was targeted at a general readership and gave detailed descriptions of most of the great expeditions which marked the turn of the century. On the cover, there was usually a single engraving under a masthead that took up half the page above 2 columns of print, or very often the entire page. Another characteristic feature was the publication of the same travelogue in 10 or more separate installments. The Wędrowiec magazine as a source of inspiration. What kind of text did Conrad read in the Wędrowiec magazine during the years 1866-74? It so happens that most of the expeditions mentioned by Conrad in his essay entitled Geography and Some Explorers were described in this very magazine, which covered almost every important exploration, ranging from the discovery of the sources of the Nile to the arrival of an expedition at the South Pole. The young Conrad could therefore immerse himself in direct reports of the explorations of Africa, Asia, Australia, and the polar regions. Owing to considerations of time, I focus on 2 thematic areas, that is, texts covering expeditions to Africa and the polar regions, as both these subjects stand out in some of Conrad's fiction. As far as Africa is concerned, Conrad could have read the following travelogues describing its exploration. For instance, the banks of the Zambezi River, excerpts from reports of Dr. Livingstone travels. These are Polish titles which I translated into English. The merchant Bolognese travelogue to the river Gazelle in Africa. The traveler Paul Belloni de Chailloux, his writings on hitherto unknown African countries. The sources of the Nile, Captain Speke's Journal of Travels and Discoveries. Mr. Tremont's travels in the Eastern Sudan. These are just several examples of more than 100 of texts on the exploration of Africa. One of the articles begins thus. On each map of Africa, even on the latest and most precise ones, in the middle, we can see a blank white space. Interestingly, years later, Conrad repeatedly referred to white or blank spaces on the map of Africa. That is, the regions he remembered from his old atlas and the Wędrowiec magazine. Quote, exciting spaces of white paper inspired his adolescent imagination. My imagination could depict to itself there worthy adventurers and devoted men nibbling at the edges. Conrad's recollection of the map-pointing scene, which recurs several times in his fiction, might therefore not be as fictitious as some critics would have us believe. In a personal record, Conrad remembers how one day, when 9 years old, while looking at a map of Africa of the time, I said to myself with absolute assurance and amazing audacity, when I grow up, I will go there. I myself would see the scene as being a transformation of childhood memories, recollections that were so strong that Conrad decided to reproduce them in various forms in several of his works. Jodie Fodder has convincingly demonstrated that when we recall the stories from our childhood, we most vividly remember the illustrations that accompanied them. So what were the illustrations that Conrad could have seen? Let's have a look at some of them. So this is the illustration to the excerpt from the account of Dr. Livingstone's travels in Africa, entitled The Banks of the Zambezi River. And the caption reads, Ma Robert, steamship on the Zambezi. Yet another one, an engraving entitled African Slaves, illustrating the description of Livingstone's expedition to Africa. An engraving entitled Caravan. Again, this is an illustration to Livingstone's journals. And now Captain Speke's Journal of Travels and Discoveries. This installment was entitled The Sources of the Nile, and the caption, An Adventure During Buffalo Hunting. Yet another illustration to Speke's Journal of Travels, entitled Turkish Merchants Relaxing on the Banks of the Nile. Yes, okay. Another significant subject which fascinated Conrad and which I want to briefly mention, and which was given comprehensive coverage by the Wędrowiec magazine, was the race to reach the North Pole. The polar expeditions which the young Conrad could have read about included, among others, McClintock's voyage on the Fox to the North Pole, the Northern Polar Voyage made by Dr. Isaac Hayes, US maritime surgeon, and also the Polaris expedition to the North Pole. In one of the reports, the author assumed that his readers were quite familiar with the geography of the polar region. We think that even without a map, our readers are able to visualize the general outline of this area. From the Bellot Strait, where McClintock spent the winter, the Boothia-Felix Peninsula extends in a southern direction. From this, we can infer that the geography of the Arctic region was well known to those readers who were interested in the exploration of the polar area. Conrad must have been one of them, as he had a good knowledge of Arctic geography and decided, as we know from the essay Geography and Some Explorers, to write a 2-page essay on the history of Arctic exploration. The account of Leopold McClintock's expedition, entitled The Voyage of the Fox in the Arctic Seas, which had been organized to locate the remains of John Franklin's lost ship, must have made an indelible mark on Conrad's imagination, because he gives the date of his own birth only indirectly as the date of the publication of this report. After more than 40 years, he professed, there could hardly have been imagined a better book to let in the breath of the stern romance of polar exploration into the existence of a boy. Here are some engravings that accompanied the accounts of polar expeditions. And this is an illustration to the excerpt from the account of McClintock's voyage, entitled McClintock's Voyage to the North Pole, and the caption, The Fox Ship Icebound. Yet another illustration to McClintock's voyage. McClintock's, the caption is Simpson Keira. One more, the caption reads, Funeral in Ice. Yet another, this time an illustration to the excerpt from the account of Hayes' voyage, the Northern Polar Voyage, and the caption, The Ship United States Wintering in Fork Harbor. Yes, I'm slowly coming to the end. This is an illustration to the excerpt from the Polaris expedition to the North Pole. The caption is The Fight with Walruses. Other thematic areas covered by the Wędrowiec magazine, which unfortunately I don't have time to analyze today, but I just want to mention them. These are a series of texts on sea storms and shipwrecks, as well as 20 excerpts from Alfred Wallace's The Malay Archipelago. To conclude, if we take a close look at the texts and illustrations that were published in the Wędrowiec magazine, the 13-year-old Conrad's idea of going to sea doesn't seem to be as strange as some Polish critics used to believe. Indeed, reading the Wędrowiec magazine could have been a significant factor that not only influenced Conrad's decision to become a seaman, but also his later fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you very much. Thank you. The third paper this afternoon is from Tanya Zuli. My notes on Tanya. Tanya is, as we know, Professor of English at the Gabriele D'Annunzio University of Chieti, Pescara. Her research interests focus on translation studies and the stylistic analysis of literary texts. She's published on colonial and post-colonial literature and language, on transnational language theory, and on cross-cultural pragmatics. Her most recent books are a translation of Conrad's short story Amy Forster from 2018, and the volume Joseph Conrad, Language and Transnationalism from 2019. She's a founding member of the AISC, the Italian Association for Conrad Studies. So, and Tanya is going to talk today about, on the topic Between Law and Literature, Pragmatic Meanings in Conrad's Language of Migration. Tanya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you to the Society Committee for organizing this conference. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. Today I'm proposing a reading of Joseph Conrad's fiction by linking it to some social and political aspects of migration in late 19th century Britain. I basically argued that echoes of the migrant figure, as represented in Conrad's short story Amy Forster, can be found in the Aliens Act, the law that was passed by the British government in 1905 to regulate the flux of migration from Eastern Europe.
Specifically, I will explore the language used in the statutes and its links to the short story, with a particular reference to the notion of undesirable immigrant. Okay. On the 11th of August 1905, the Aliens Act was passed. Although other laws on migration had been passed before, the Aliens Act was the first modern law to be considered as an expression of the political and ideological ideas about race, religion, and nationalism at the beginning of the 20th century. However, after taking effect on the 1st of January 1906, the Aliens Act was deemed inconsistent and ambiguous by many contemporary politicians for two main reasons. First, because even if it didn't mention any specific ethnic group, it was clearly addressed to persecuted Jews traveling from Eastern Europe to Britain. And second, because it envisaged permission for entry to be granted verbally by immigration officers and not through written documents. The origins of Jewish migration must be traced back to the 1880s, when a large number of immigrants fleeing persecution in the Russian Empire moved to London. Problems of overcrowding and fears for the spread of criminality and disease were frequently discussed in political circles as well as by the press. After the May laws were issued in Russia, thousands of immigrants were forced to leave their countries, many of them intending to reach the United States, traveling via the United Kingdom or Germany. At that time, no system of registration regulated the number of immigrants in Britain, and the Aliens Act was considered an important instrument of control. These were the events that Conrad might have had in mind when writing the story of Janko Gural, an emigrant from the Carpathians shipwrecked on the coast of Kent. Conrad had completed his last sea voyage on the Clipper Torrens in 1893, and 1 year later, he had given up his career on the sea to live permanently in Britain. These were the years in which he published some of his most important works, Almayer's Folly, The Nigger of the Narcissus, Start of Darkness, Lord Jim. Over this period, he cultivated his interest in European and international politics, and as his letters and occasional pieces demonstrate. Both Conrad's life experiences and his knowledge of contemporary politics in relation to the issues of migration were crucial in the writing of his short story, Amy Foster. In the short story, the representation of mass migration takes its shape in the figure of a single character whose point of view conveys a realistic portrait of the tragic destiny of the emigrants, and I quote, passing through years of precarious existence with people to whom their strangeness was an object of suspicion, dislike, or fear. Despite its focus on the migrants' individual condition of solitude and desolation, Conrad's narrative establishes important connections with the complex European background of boundary crossings. The reasons for Janko's departures from his native country are not political. In fact, he is not fleeing government persecution, but escaping from poverty. He leaves his hometown through a bogus organization, hiring poor mountaineers who pay for their journey by selling cattle and small pieces of land. And here's the description of the three men recruiting migrants in Conrad's story. The three men ironically evoke the Aliens Act, in which the immigration board for a port shall consist of 3 persons summoned in accordance with rules made by the Secretary of State under this act, out of a list approved by him for the port, comprising fit persons having magisterial, business, or administrative experience. Like government officials, the false bureaucrats in the short story stage a sort of theatrical farce in which they replicate part of the administrative organization lying behind the migration system. Dressed in fake uniforms, they pretend they are using a telegraph to talk to the Emperor of America, who decides about the emigrants' destiny. Conrad is also alluding to Jewish support systems for the traffic of migrants regularly portrayed in the newspapers of the time. In fact, The opinion was shared that refusing entrance to poor immigrants would also stop such networks from bringing poor people to England through scams involving clothes and money, just as in Janko's case. The ironic reference to Jews in the story does not conform to the historical representation of Jewish refugees seeking improved economic conditions in the late 19th and early 20th century. If Janko, who is actually a Catholic, is the personification of such a group of emigrants, the Jews in the short story fall into a different category of wealthy owners, such as the Jew innkeeper to whom Janko's father sells a cow to gather the money for his son's journey. References to the migration system abound in the narrative, testifying to Conrad's awareness of the historical and political moment he was experiencing from a wide European viewpoint. Even if he did not mention contemporary legal and political actions on migration in his essays and in his letters, he was aware of the impacts on society, of their impacts on society, and would take into account common attitudes on immigrants as threatening to the social order. Conrad's knowledge about the legal status of migrants may be inferred by his description of Janko's condition. In his literary depiction of the emigrant, he contemplated a range of cultural and racial stereotypes giving shape to national anxieties about foreigners. Therefore, Gural's status could be read as an archetype of the figure of the undesirable immigrant, as featured in the Aliens Act. In Amy Foster, the relationship between narrative writing and social understanding is strengthened through Janko Gural, whose characterization establishes a direct link with the socially acknowledged image of the alien, as it was described in essays, newspaper articles, and reports at the time when Conrad's short story was being written. This image was later to be present in the Aliens Act as that of the undesirable immigrant. Conrad anticipates this definition through the character of Janko Gural, or more simply, he fictionalizes a social figure that was already well known at the end of the 19th century. From a legal viewpoint, the Aliens Act introduced the definition of undesirable immigrant by following a set of precise criteria, exposed some exceptions, and gave directions on how immigration officers may withhold leave or repatriate them. Entrance might be granted to those, and I quote, seeking admission solely to avoid prosecution or punishment on religious or political grounds, involving danger of imprisonment or danger to life, end of quote. Apart from a few other exceptions, all the other immigrants were considered undesirable and unlikely to be given the right to enter. The language of the Act can be immediately recognized as underpinning refusal more than enhancing hospitality. Rules are given in terms of negation: shall not be landed, shall withhold leave, cannot show, and also positive statements are conveyed through negative, mandatory forms. Leave to land shall not be refused, and so on and so forth. From a linguistic viewpoint, Conrad's short story sets the environments of the immigrant's perception by following standards similar to the Aliens Act. In fact, the same terms of negation are used to describe the villager's conduct towards the horrid-looking man who is received with rough and angry tones, shouted at and hit. According to the Act, an immigrant should be considered an undesirable immigrant under specific conditions. A, if he cannot show that he has in his possession or is in a position to obtain the means of decently supporting himself, or B, if he is a lunatic or an idiot, or C, if he has been sentenced in a foreign country with which there is an extradition treaty for a crime, or D, if an expulsion order under this Act has been made in his case. On his arrival at the village, Janko fulfills at least two of these conditions. He does not have the means of supporting himself, and he is considered by the village inhabitants as both a lunatic and an idiot. Described as a hairy sort of gypsy fellow, an unfortunate dirty tramp, a troublesome lunatic, a sort of wild animal, and an excitable devil, Gural does not only embody the notion of undesirable immigrant, but also expands its meaning. As any unwelcome immigrant, Janko is a victim of isolation and despair, as well as the object of scorn and offense. More than that, Janko contributes to the disruption of the community balance in various ways. He unsettles the economic stability of Amy's parents, who cannot rely on her wage after she marries him. He speaks an incomprehensible, unearthly language and has manners and behaviors that the villagers find quite disturbing. Seen in the perspective of the social and cultural setting of the period, this literary representation introduces a figure more complex than the emigrant, embodying threats to national identity. Here, the polysemic value of the expression undesirable immigrant carries a double pragmatic meaning, leading back to the socio-historical context of anarchism. At the end of the 19th century, in fact, the reason for the immigrant's undesirability would focus on exclusion based on ethnic diversity on the one hand, and on implicit conceptual links with social violence and political agitation on the other. In particular, anarchism had clear historical reference around ideas about race and resettlement, promoting widespread anxiety about immigration. Also in The Secret Agent, Conrad replicates a late 19th century literary cliché. Connections between immigrant Jews and exiled anarchists abound in the fiction of this period, promoting anti-immigration sentiments on the basis of anarchist revolutions. As a prototype of the undesirable immigrant, Janko Gural anticipates somehow the social and cultural position of the anarchist. In his later novels, Conrad was to develop the figure of the undesirable immigrant by giving it a strict political connotation. More than that, Amy Foster denotes the evolution of the character as an expression of current forms of xenophobia, demonstrating Conrad's interest in the analysis of the complexities and contradictions of a society shaped, as he would say, by the Western race. Despite his declarations of indifference, but my dearest, really, I read nothing and I never look at the papers, so I know nothing of politics and literature, he would write in 1898. So despite these declarations, his genuine interest in the events and trends that changed Europe was to be found in the shape of his novels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Excellent timekeeping. Final paper in this wonderfully international panel is from Yael Levin. Yael is an associate professor of English at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the second vice president of the Joseph Conrad Society of America. She has 2 monographs on Joseph Conrad, Tracing the Aesthetic Principle in Conrad's Novels from 2008 and Joseph Conrad's Slow Modernism from 2020. She's also published on modernism, postmodernism, narratology, the subject, and disability in a number of journals and volumes, including 20th Century Literature, the Journal of Modern Literature, and the Journal of Beckett Studies. And today, she's going to be talking about Joseph Conrad's Chance, Determinism, Contingency, and the Dictates of Narrative Form. Yael, over to you.
Thanks, Robert. It's absolutely glorious to see everyone. And I just wanted to say that I do have an alternative title that is more in tune with the situation. Conrad demonstrates how to avoid drifting unconsciously into nihilistic abandonment. So I'm just going to start. Critics are divided on the meaning of the title of Conrad's novel. In 1954, Bruce Harkness claimed that the basis of the novel, far from being a representation of accidental occurrences, is the reverse of chance. A like assessment was more recently presented by Richard Ruppel, who writes that Chance's plot works systematically through a series of chance occurrences to predictable conclusions. John G. Peters sees the title differently. He finds that the idea of chance is central to what Conrad tries to do here. It signals the novel out as the first in a series of stylistic departures from Conrad's earlier works. Conrad's writing will now center on a world controlled by chance. Where Peters views the title as representative of the novel's purported message, Harkness and Ruppel see it as its ironic subversion. My paper reads this critical disagreement as a symptom of an ambivalence in the novel itself. Diagnosing the novel's inconsistent attitude to chance allows me to reframe some of the themes to which critics have returned in their treatment of the novel, namely its commercial success and its moral stance. My claim is that the way in which the author presents contingency emerges as a key to his choice of audience and to the authorial responsibilities that such a choice dictates. What is at stake in the decision whether to promote contingency or determinism is the very question of his artistic legacy. Is Conrad a modern writer or a pander to public opinion? Will he educate and morally support his readers, or rather choose to drift into a potentially nihilistic modernism? In order to demonstrate how these questions converge, I'd like to draw your attention to two contradictory passages in the author's preface to the novel. The author's note opens with the question of how to do things differently, how to avoid the kind of determinism that is so ingrained in the conventions of fiction. Conrad writes, "Chance is one of my novels that shortly after having been begun were laid aside for a few months. Starting impetuously like a sanguine oarsman setting forth in the early morning, I came very soon to a fork in the stream and found it necessary to pause and reflect seriously upon the direction I would take. I floated in the calm water of pleasant speculation between the diverging currents of conflicting impulses with an agreeable but perfectly irrational conviction that neither of those currents would take me to destruction. My sympathies being equally divided and the two forces being equal, it is perfectly obvious that nothing but mere chance influenced my decision in the end." The sentiment may be read with 19th century thought on the limitations of reason and agency. Choice and the exertion of will are no longer seen as key to human evolution. History is now perceived as the product of contingency, eventualities that are determined by a range of non-human forces, cellular mutation, the market, history, and technology. The shift is marked here by the attempt to shake authorial control and allow the novel to develop freely without the determinism of generic conventions. The forks in the path and the choosing of direction are suggestive of generic conventions, narrative choices on the level of plot. The idea of floating is pleasant and irrational. It allows for contingency in the making of the narrative and abandonment of the rules of rationality and categorical logic. It is commensurate with the giving up of agency. In keeping with Peters' assessment, we may read the passage as an indication of the author's attempt to explore a narrative method that is distinct from that utilized previously. Even the experimental plot design of Lord Jim follows Aristotle's principle of moral action, where crime must be followed by punishment. Instead of subordinating the action to the determinations of moral law, Chance supposedly reports the lives of its characters as they develop. The author will not bend the course of the narrative to serve any extraneous intention. We see the fictional correlate of this choice in the oppositional pairing of Fine and Marlowe. Where Fine pounds along the road, Marlowe drifts. For Marlowe, who doesn't know where they are going, the road extends into the unknown. By a strange illusion, the road appeared to run up against a lot of low stars at no great distance. But as we advance, new stretches of whitey brown ribbon seem to come up from under the black ground. Where Marlowe's feelings are in a state of confusion, Fine can determine whether they are engaged in a farce or in a tragedy. His mapping of the journey means he knows which twists and turns will follow and where they will lead. In keeping with the oxymoronic nature of his publication, The Tramp's Itinerary, he always knows where he is going. Fine's controlling nature extends from mapping the path to mapping the future. Marlowe questions Fine's method of planning an intervention on Flora's behalf by considering all possible contingencies and their perceived consequences. Fine feared future complications, naturally. He owned to me in the parlor of my farmhouse that he had been very much concerned then at the possible consequences. But as he was making this artless confession, I said to myself that whatever consequences and complications he might have imagined, the complication from which he was suffering now could never have presented itself to his mind. Marlowe draws our attention to the impossibility of predicting the future. But what then remains? If any attempt to control the future is doomed to fail, how is one to act responsibly and morally? The novel is haunted by the suggestion that a world without clear causal links might lead to nihilistic abandonment, despair, and isolation. It is a like suspicion that we encounter in the author's note in a passage that challenges the sentiments that precede it. Commenting on the novel's popularity, Conrad writes, "This success gave me a considerable amount of pleasure because what I always feared most was drifting unconsciously into the position of a writer for a limited coterie, a position which would have been odious to me as throwing a doubt on the soundness of my belief in the solidarity of all mankind in simple ideas and in sincere emotions." The slippage observed here between contingency, as signaled by unconscious drifting, and a loss of values, throwing doubt on simple ideas and sincere emotions, is telling. Conrad believes that an author's choice of contingency as a moral, thematic, and stylistic pivot entails the loss of the authority of a narrative driven by values and one's appeal for a wide readership. The slippage is beautifully summed up in the transition from the pleasant floating of the first passage to unconscious drifting in the second. The words may be synonymous insofar as they describe movement without agency, but where the first is morally neutral, the second often functions in Conrad's work as a symbol for the loss of a moral compass or the foreshadowing of misadventure. Falk and the Shadow Line provide powerful examples of the morally damning implications of drifting at sea. Whether it spells a loss of morale or an act of cannibalism, the turn from floating to drifting linguistically recasts contingency in a condemnatory light. Leaving things to chance on a ship suggests a weak or crippled command, a loss of values and morale. The same rule applies to an author who fails to do his duty to his readers. The introduction of the theme of chance as the novel's overarching principle thus gives way here to an uneasy repudiation. The author's note unfolds as a rather ambivalent manifesto on chance. It begins by promoting the theme as a new model for stringing together events and narrative, and concludes by reflecting on the moral risks attending such artistic innovation. The correction seeps into the narrative. Marlowe's leisurely and passive attitude is now made to serve categorical logic. Irrational drifting is swapped out for a morally engaged receptivity. We see an indication of the way contingency is made to bend to categorical logic in the way Marlowe describes the difference between information and knowledge. Note how the conceptual nuance hinges on the idea of chance. Information is something one goes out to seek and puts away when found, as you might do a piece of lead, ponderous, useful, unvibrating, dull. Whereas knowledge comes to one, this sort of knowledge a chance acquisition preserving in its repose a fine resonant quality. Unlike information, knowledge is the product of receptivity to the world that is neither teleological nor foreclosed, but open to chance. Freedom is fine so long as it contributes to rational thought. The modification is emphasized in Marlowe's comment that to drift is the only reposeful sort of motion, ask any ship if it isn't, and therefore consistent with thoughtfulness. We are allowed the experience of drifting then, an experience that might be seen to cohere with contingency still. However, what we no longer have is that modern expression of a passive drifting towards the unknown. Drift is redefined as a receptivity that feeds intellection. The significance of this reformulation is brought to bear on the responsibility of the author. The following exchange between Marlowe and young Powell offers a neat expression of this retraction and the reasons behind it. Marlowe begins, "Luckily, people, whether mature or not mature, and who really is ever mature, are for the most part quite incapable of understanding what is happening to them. But we, my dear Marlowe, have the inestimable advantage of understanding what is happening to others," I struck in, "or at least some of us do. Is that too a provision of nature? And what is it for? Is it that we may amuse ourselves gossiping about each other's affairs? You, for instance, see—" "I don't know what I see," Marlowe silenced me, "and surely life must be amused somehow. It would be still a very respectable provision if it were only for that end. But from that same provision of understanding, there springs in us compassion, charity, indignation, the sense of solidarity, and in minds of any largeness an inclination to that indulgence which is next door to affection. The observer's understanding is tied to those same values whose disappearance worries Conrad in his author's note. The narrator, the storyteller, and by extension the author must fulfill the role of a knowing observer, one who will provide answers and glosses on experiences that elude us as we drift through life. The weight of this responsibility is impressed upon the reader through a whole network of linked professions in the novel. Writers, reporters, financiers, who are all committed to the extraction of profit or the preaching of misguided ideologies, rather than the espousing of the humanist ideals on which a healthy community thrives. Marlowe sees himself as a singular voice in the din, a man conscious of the necessity of providing real insight. Flora, Captain Anthony, young Powell, and the Fiends receive the benefit of his help. And though the implied author often reminds the reader that Marlowe's help is not quite what he himself believes it to be, Flora's comment that it is the dog and not his own intervention that prevents her from jumping is a case in point. Still, Conrad's negotiation of his titular theme would suggest that behind the ironies attached to Marlowe's efforts to assist and comfort the people he encounters, there is real underlying authorial sentiment. What I brought here is a snapshot of a more comprehensive treatment of the novel in Slow Modernism, which is now out. This is in chapter 4. Many thanks for your attention. Till we meet again.
Thank you, Yael. That was very nice. We have about 12, 13 minutes for questions, so I'm going to try and handle that. Thanks, Yael. If you could unmute and put your hands up, and I'll try and spot you. Helen.
Okay. To Agnes, thank you, Agnes. Thank you very much for your. That was just wonderful to see those images. I just want to ask you very quickly if you get to, if your archive is the link that you get to for Polish National Library of Poland through Europeana. Is that how you got at those images, or is there some other archive that I don't know about?
No, it's not through Europeana. It's University Library Archive.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
If you want a link, I can send you the link to the library.
Because I thought I was just fantastic to look at those, and I want to look at a whole lot more of that magazine.
Okay.
I'm trying to see raised hands. Oh, Catherine. Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for really fascinating papers. Tanya, I had a question for you with yours, which I found really fascinating. I was just wondering if if you could say a little bit more about the changes that Conrad makes from the public perception of the alien as kind of Jewish and political, essentially, to somebody who's Catholic and depoliticized, and the way in which Conrad shifts Jewishness onto the human traffickers back in Eastern Europe and away from Janko, and the kind of, I suppose, the tensions perhaps there, and Conrad creating a sympathetic immigrant, but somebody who doesn't actually reflect immigration as it was being presented in the popular media at the time. And that seems to me rather different from the representation of immigration in the later political novels, and particularly Secret Agent, and what you think is going on there.
Yeah, thank you, Yael. This is very interesting. It's a very perceptive comment. I've been thinking about this, and my perception is that Conrad makes Janko Gural a Catholic, and religion and Catholicism in Janko Gural are a very cultural thing. It's not precisely, you know, religion. So it's something to deal with, linked to Poland, to traditions, as a real, you know, Polish would be at that time. So on the other hand, the Janko as an emigrant undergoes exactly the experiences that Jewish would undergo during their, you know, migrations in terms of travel and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's kind of ambivalent because as from the description, you would say is actually depicting Jewish people immigrations to America through Germany and you know, the United Kingdom. And on the other hand, however, you know, Janko is a Catholic. I think there are two plans in there to be considered. That is to say, the social like background and the social description he would introduce in his short story, the one he actually took from his readings and newspapers and so on and so forth, and the character Janko Gural, his own individuality, which was kind of more personal. I'm not sure I've completely answered to your question, but this is something I thought about actually.
Thank you. Jay, you had a question.
Could I just, before we move on, could I just weigh in on this, the Jewish elephant in the room? I seem to be the Jewish elephant in the room right now. The question I think is he doesn't actually shift anything, because of this story of the Jewish travel agents was everywhere in media at the end of the 19th century. They're very, very famous trials in which they were brought to trial because they were accused of misleading people exactly like Janko, who would sell their lands and leave. And there was this discourse about we don't want to lose our good citizens, right? We want to leave them inside. We want to leave them here. We don't want them to travel. So this is all based on things that were happening in politics and in the media. And so in that sense, I don't feel that there is a shift happening here so much as an actual representation of the kind of discourses that one would encounter in the press. Does that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it deals with that double, I would say it's a double perspective. On the one hand, the very realistic representation of the journey and of the organization, of those Jewish organizations, which Conrad certainly had taken from the press, about which he had been reading and so on and so forth. And on the other, the concentration on the individual, on the single person, on the on the tragedy of on individual tragedy, which is basically present in every novel by Conrad, isn't it? So yes, and thank you, Yael. Yeah, I've been reading about laws and these things, so I'm aware it was a really topical, subject at that time.
Anthony.
Hi. My question is addressed to both Tanya and Katie, and it ties back in with the two papers yesterday, which were based around the current day now virus, Joanna's paper and Tanaka's paper. I posted it, but I wasn't able to ask it yesterday. And it's in a way about what seemed to me to bring together, all of the papers, but Tanya's and Katie's is about forms of silence and anonymity, in the sense that current laws now seem to stem a lot of anti-immigration laws or rhetoric come from an idea of people being fearful, which is what the virus has created. But the fear has become within us, as it were, and internally. So the anonymity, as I think Katie was arguing, is almost has been domesticized. So within the very home where you think you know the people, there's silence. And Winnie doesn't really know Verloc, doesn't really want to know Verloc. Stevie can't properly articulate anything. Verloc ignores anybody else but himself. So there's a kind of domesticated form of anonymity which is made public through acts of parliament that Tanya has talked about, the 1905 Immigration Act, you know, the use of the word alien. And this is full of the newspapers now, you know, our fear of immigration, of refugees, which we don't call refugees, we call them all kinds of nasty words. And we call them a virus, so we call them, we're being invaded. So that's that kind of built-in fear which structures our political ways of thinking. And as Katie almost has pointed out, that politics goes into the very home and not just, as it were, at a generalized political level. I don't know if there's any comment on that or if that's rather stupid.
I'll leave space to Katie if she wants to say something, otherwise I'll just make a short comment.
It was an interesting point, but to be honest, I have not thought before this point. I mean, I have not connected it with the current situation, so it needs more think to answer this question and somehow to connect current situation with the secret agent. So,
well, I think as Katie demonstrated, I mean, as she showed in her paper and as my paper tries to show as well, the question of silence, anonymity related, and fear as well, related to the present. I mean, it's really striking. I mean, as far as Conrad's short story, Amy Foster, the story of migration is concerned, this is a short story that could have been written like a week ago. It is so topical in its very descriptions, in both in the descriptions of the journey and of the feelings, in the description of fear, xenophobia, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I keep on reading and rereading, and I'm stuck on this short story because every time I really find topical, elements which made me think and rethink about today's situation as well. Yeah, I'll just stop here. I don't want to speak all the time.
I think there's time for one last question from Jay, who's been waiting for a while.
Thank you very much. I also really enjoyed all the papers. My question is for Yael, and it relates to the connection that you made between drifting unconsciously and sort of chance and contingency. Correct me if I'm sort of misunderstanding you, please. But I just wonder, because it seems to me that in my reading of chance, the sort of unconscious is connected not so much to chance, but to a kind of determinism, and also that drifting, if we sort of think about the way that drifting functions in relation to water, is also connected to a kind of determinism. So I just wondered whether or not you had any thoughts on the way perhaps that Conrad is kind of deconstructing or challenging the kind of binary between determinism and chance, or determinism and contingency. I mean, I think contingency itself is a really interesting word, because if something's contingent upon it, then it's kind of determined by it. So I'm going to stop talking now and just throw it over to you. Not particularly coherent, sorry, but I wondered what your thoughts were on those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. It's great to see you. I think there is a real ambivalence in the novel. the attempt to correct it comes from a kind of a fear of losing that kind of ability to bring the ideas back to some kind of rational deciphering or providing some kind of real insight that can be communicated to an audience or to listeners. And this is Conrad's problem, just like it is Marlowe's in a sense. So I think he wants to let go. I think he wants to do something different, and he wants to be a modernist. But I think he really fears it, particularly from a moral perspective, because I still think that there is this need to bring it back to morality, and that's something that for him exists within the realm of categorical logic, not with it has. And I know you're asking about determinism as opposed to, and you're not really asking so much about the emphasis that I'm trying to bring out. But I wonder if we can move beyond this fear of, right, how do we present it logically? How do we present an idea that can be held and can be communicated to this openness and the undoing of determinism? I think he wants to, but I don't think he can, is my response to that. So if you have other ways of seeing it, I would love for you to share that with me.
Okay. Right now?
Or you can write in the chat box, or
should we continue the conversation after do we have time?
I'm conscious that it's now gone 5 o'clock, and I wanted to thank all 5 speakers for 5 really excellent papers this afternoon.